Our story begins on a Tuesday back in 1917. It's the height of World War I, and it just so happens that all is quiet in the Pacific Ocean. It seems like it's a galaxy away from where all the news stories are coming from, all of the stories about trenches and artillery and all of the horrors of lost sons and fathers. But in the South Pacific, things are a lot quieter. Things seem to be well. Well, as this particular ship you can see pictured here was sailing, a French crude ship, they were carrying regular supplies off the coast of South America. And as they were sailing along, they were very surprised to be met by, it couldn't be gunfire, could it? How could there be active artillery fire in the middle of nowhere? And as their crew looked around, they saw a second ship, the Sea Adler, a ship with sails and also with steam propulsion, steaming towards them and requiring their immediate attention. They, of course, had to stop and meet the crew of this raider, an opportunistic boat with a flag, asking for them to turn over all their valuables and to surrender to the country of Germany. Stories began to spread through the South Pacific. A dreaded raider was on the loose. In fact, there were several raiders on the loose. And as the news got back to Australia, people began to wonder, wow, what's happening? Why is our ocean being attacked? This captain on this ship, the Sea Adler, that's a sea eagle, was a very, very wise captain, very skilled in what he did. And he was able to capture, I counted, I think, about a dozen ships or so, maybe even a couple more. And he had several hundred prisoners, plus a whole bunch of booty that he was able to capture. This is the time where we enter our key character for tonight, Eric. Eric was a bright young man who was born in South Australia, where I've been able to live the last few years, and he just happens to be a left-hander. I believe Sir Donald Bradman was also a left-hander, and Eric, also having an interest in cricket, got a few comments as he played his cricket. He really enjoyed himself. He was assigned to HMAS, this is the Australian Navy. The ship was called the Encounter, and you can see a couple of pictures. One of them's moored here in Sydney Harbour at the time. And he was initially assigned a fairly simple role. He was just about 19 years old, but he was very excited to be going to see some new places. One of his first assignments was to go across from New Zealand to Perth, underneath the bottom of Australia, the Great Australian Bight, and his ship provided escort for the troop ships that were taking the New Zealand Anzacs across to the war in Europe. Now, Eric was given some responsibilities, and he also started to pay attention to his captain. As his captain was doing these escort missions across the Great Australian Bight, some amended orders were received that they were to go into the Pacific to go hunting for these German raiders. There was rumours of at least 3 ships that were going around capturing merchant shipping, and Eric's captain and the Encounter here were given orders to try and intercept these ships. As they sailed towards the Pacific, Tahiti we call it now, French Polynesia, the captain had a couple of ideas up his sleeve. He said, wait a minute, this is an opportunity for us to get these raiders, but how are we going to catch them? We don't have GPS, we don't have radar and all that kind of stuff yet. we need to attract them somehow. How can we attract them? So the captain decided that he would pretend he was a merchant ship. He changed his call sign, he changed his flags, and he began to broadcast on the radio as if he was another merchant ship, hoping to attract some raiders perhaps. And this ship sailed around the Pacific for several months, just waiting to be attacked by the raiders. Unfortunately for Eric and his ship, the Sea Adler had been so successful and so full of treasure that they had gone to find shelter. And they ended up putting down anchor. A storm came up, they were blown across the rocks, and the ship was grounded on the reef. But a rescue ship, not realizing who the Sea Adler was, came to help them, and the captain of the Sea Adler was able to commandeer the rescue ship and make a clean getaway. So by the time that Eric and his ship, the Encounter, got on the scene, it was already too late. That one ship was grounded, the other two ships had gone back, so it was a fruitless search. But in this time, Eric began to learn a little bit about secret codes and a little bit about deception and about tricking the enemy and picking up their codes. Here's a picture on the deck of Encounter. You can see a whole bunch of men lined up. This is payday, and Eric was given the role of Paymaster. So he would give the men their wages, and he himself was getting, I think, about 11 shilling a day at that time, if I remember correctly. And he was in charge of looking after the well-being of the men, their uniforms, as well as their food, and also some legal advice, and just being a friend. It also gave him access to the secret code books, and Eric began to study these because he had a bit of an interest in numbers. Look at this picture here. It's here Pussycat looking through a circle. That circle is actually the muzzle of one of the guns. If you look at the other picture on the deck, you see that gun in the background. That was the ship's mascot, the Pussycat for the Encounter. Sometime after this, Eric began to become eligible for a rank upgrade, but one of the requirements was to learn a foreign language. Eric was a bit of an entrepreneur, and he thought to himself, wait a minute, I could get 11 shilling a day, which I'm getting right now, and if I learn German or French, I'll get an extra sixpence or half a shilling. So going from 11 to 11 and a half coins per day, that's pretty good. But he also found out that if he learned Japanese, he would get an extra 5 shillings per day. And the wheels began to turn, and he thought, imagine if I could make that much money. I'd like to find out how I can make some more money. So he began to scheme, how can I get to school and learn some more? Eric approached the Australian Navy and said, could you please sponsor me to go to school? I want to go to night classes. I want to learn Japanese, please, for my rank upgrade. And the Navy said, I'm sorry, we have lots of requests for money. We don't know if you're any good. Maybe it's best if we just leave you to it. Maybe you want to do French or German instead. But Eric was a bit of a persistent fellow, and he happened to come across another guy called Eric, who was a friend of his in the Navy. For those of you that like aviation history, this other Eric happens to be the younger brother of a very famous Australian, Sir Charles Kingsford-Smith. So Eric Kingsford-Smith and Eric, our Aussie codebreaker, went to school together. They were sponsored by the Australian Navy, who were getting a bargain now because they were paying the same price for 2 students to go through and learn rather than just one. The Erics were very pleased. At the end of the training, Eric did very, very well. He scored a 90% on his language test, an unheard of score in those days, and people began to pay attention. Boy, this guy has a bit of a gift for picking up Japanese. As a result of this, Eric was sent off to Japan, where he studied for several years, and he made some good friends over there. He really enjoyed his time in Japan. He climbed Mount Fuji twice, I believe, And there was a saying that said, it's really important, I forget exactly how it was, but along the lines of, you're stupid to climb it never, and you're stupid to climb it twice. But he really enjoyed himself both times. He said it was a very, very arduous adventure, but he had very fond memories. And he made, as I said, some really good friends with his time over there. By 1927, he was doing so well in his acquisition, he was being used as a translator, that the British paid attention. Now, this is the time when Australia and England were sort of, you know, big brother, little brother, or maybe father-son relationship. So it was a real honour when Eric the Australian was invited to go to England to do further studies in code breaking. And specifically, he was called to the Government Code and Cipher School, Room 40, which for those of you that are history buffs, is a pretty famous place. And he ended up working very hard there and becoming one of the pioneers and one of the experts in his particular field of intercepting messages. Now, I'm not advocating tonight how we should live our lives. I'm just telling how Eric lived his life and how he was directed. But he ended up picking up a lot of mail that was being sent from the embassy in London to Tokyo. And he would get access to this mail and read it, take notes, and then keep it on file. And sometime later, as he began to get scrambled messages or coded messages, he began to learn how to unscramble and decode these messages, and people were very interested in what he was finding. This is a newspaper article that was published in South Australia, near where I was the last few years at Gladstone, South Australia. And this is basically the front page of the local newspaper, coming from the front page of the Daily Telegraph in London a week earlier. This was such big news that it made the front lines of London and Gladstone just making note that Eric had now been invited, seconded, not just to study in the Royal Navy, but to be taken over as a recruit, employed as a lieutenant in the Royal Navy. This was a huge honour for an Australian, and I could be corrected tonight, but I believe Eric was the very first Australian to be recruited directly into the Royal Navy, let alone this secret unit. As I said, this is very unusual because at this time, all of the brightest and smartest were coming from the British Navy to the Australian Navy. Eric's own captain on the Encounter had been a British captain in the Royal Navy. So for Eric to be going the other way and giving skills to the Royal Navy, that was pretty special. About this time, there's some unrest going on in the world. If we fast forward to the London Naval Treaty, at this time there was a bit of an agreement between the United States, England and Japan as to how the arms race would be controlled. People didn't want one country to just build a whole bunch of warships and submarines. So the three countries, the US, England and Japan, had an agreement as to what the ratio of building could be. And it was agreed in the group that Japan should only have 3 for every 5 that the other 2 countries had. And there was a bit of debate backwards and forwards about this, but Eric was able to intercept the messages between the Japanese advisors in Tokyo and finding out what they were talking behind closed doors. So when the British came to negotiate, they had the advantage of knowing what the other side was already bringing to the table. And this, I'm not advocating this, by the way, but I'm just telling you, this is how Eric was getting involved to try and see what's happening behind the scenes. What's the other side doing? How can we position our best interests with all of the information that we can get? About this time, Eric also gathered some information that there was some plans afoot to defend and to prepare and to stockpile fuel for a possible war with the United States. Now this is 1930, And nobody was thinking this kind of way. At this time, Japan and England were very close allies. They were cooperating together with naval exercises. They were sharing procedures and techniques together. And so as Eric was beginning to find this information, people were sort of a bit incredulous. Well, that can't be right. He must have some wrong information. It must be that something's not right here. He can't possibly be picking up what's really happening. I want to just keep that story on hold for a minute, and I want to show you a clay tablet. This is a very special clay tablet that's very, very old. This is called the Babylonian, well, it's one of the Babylonian Chronicles, and it is the records of the kings of Babylon about 7th century BCE, so looking about 2,800 odd years ago. And there's a series of clay tablets, like a journal form or a diary, talking about what these particular kings were up to back at this time. And it talks about the idea that there was a king by the name of Nebuchadnezzar, mentioned on this tablet here, who was a crown prince who was going to the west from Babylon and going through what is modern-day Syria. He was waging several military campaigns, taking people prisoner, applying tribute, and even setting up his own kings. He specifically mentions coming to a little place called Jerusalem, about 597 BC, according to the Babylonian reckoning of time, and taking some treasure and some prisoners from there as well. And in this picture you see some young teenagers or young adults from Jerusalem were taken captive back to Babylon. Now, it's very interesting. At this time, these Babylonians had a real interest in looking at the stars and the planets. They were into astronomy quite a lot, but maybe more like astrology. And if you are interested in ancient history, we have today several astronomical observation tables and tablets where the Babylonian scientists would record various meteorological as well as astronomical data. And they thought maybe if we can decipher the planets, maybe if we can work out what's happening up in the stars, maybe that'll tell us some important information from the gods. Maybe that'll give us some information that will help us to see something that's important for us to know about. In this context, however, the king of this country was a skeptic. He was a cynic. He was not so trusting of his wise men and advisors, and he thought to himself, I'm not sure if I can trust my wise men. They talk real smooth, but what if they're not genuine? What if they're just pretending? I've got a couple of passages here that demonstrate Nebuchadnezzar's skepticism. And it says here that there were two false prophets, Ahab and Zedekiah, on the screen you can see there. These are not to be confused with other people with the same name. These are people we don't know about anywhere else in recorded history. But these evidently were false prophets who had said things that could not be proved or substantiated. And as a result of that, Nebuchadnezzar said, right, I'm going to execute those two. And as a result, those two people died. But Nebuchadnezzar wasn't just willing to kill those people. He also had another time where he was a little bit skeptical. And the text is a bit smaller than I was hoping to see, so I'll see if I can read this one. One night during the 2nd year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had such disturbing dreams that he couldn't sleep. He called in his magicians, his enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers, and he demanded that they tell him what he had dreamed. As they stood before the king, he said, I've had a dream that deeply troubles me, and I must know what it means. The astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, Long live the king! Tell us the dream, and we will tell you what it means. But the king said to the astrologers, I am serious about this. If you don't tell me what my dream was and what it means, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. But if you tell me what I dreamed and what the dream means, I will give you many wonderful gifts and honours. Just tell me the dream and what it means." They said again, "Please, your majesty, tell us the dream, and we will tell you what it means." And look at the next passage here. This king is a skeptic. He's not a believer. He says this, "The king replied, I know what you are doing. You're stalling for time because you know I am serious when I say, if you don't tell me the dream, you are doomed. So you have conspired to tell me lies, hoping I will change my mind. But tell me the dream, and then I'll know what you can tell me, that you can tell me what it means." If you remember, for those of you that were here last night, we talked about magic. We talked about the difference between people who can do amazing tricks and do all kinds of amazing things compared with somebody who can see and read future events. And we kind of, for those of you that were here last night, we kind of agreed, I think. I certainly concluded that it's more powerful when someone can predict the future than to see a magic trick, because magic tricks can be faked. People can pull a quickie, a sleight of hand. And Nebuchadnezzar, he's not going to have the wool pulled over his eyes either, is he? He's saying, hey, wait a minute, I'm not sure if you guys are trustworthy. Tell me what I dreamed, and then I'll know that I can trust what you said. Let's go back to Eric and put that story with the dream on hold. As Eric's time continued in the work of the Royal Navy, he was once again assigned to a ship, this time to a Royal Navy ship, sent from London back to Asia. And his job this time was to help in translating and pick up some more intelligence for the Royal Navy. And unfortunately in 1930, for those of you that have a bit of interest in history, this was a time of unrest and sadness in Asia. And as things were developing, there was a skirmish between two countries, and Eric was involved in picking up information and trying to pressure one side to be different in their military strategies. And as Eric was picking up his data, he was getting once again some very interesting inside information, and he passed it on to his commanding officer, who was able to bring about some very interesting, effective negotiations, so that the civilians that were being targeted and hurt at this time could be given a bit of a reprieve. Eric's code wasn't just for his own benefit. He felt it was for the benefit of the people that were around him. And he got great joy, great pleasure from this. One night he got a code telling or suggesting, he wasn't quite sure what the code was about, but it sounded like there'd be a massive armada of ships coming up the Yangtze River. And he approached his commanding officer and said, "Sir, the code's a bit hard to read, but I think it's telling us 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, Yangtze River mouth, something big's coming." Next morning, it was very much in. It was very interesting when this big armada of ships arrived, and the word came back to Eric. "Hey, Eric, your code breaking seems to have worked, because at 8 o'clock this morning, right on time, there was, and the list of what arrived was forwarded to Eric." As a result of this, Eric was able to increase the entries in his code book and decipher some more of the terms in the code, so that he could have a better understanding of what was being transmitted. Of course, if I didn't clarify before, at this time when people would send codes through radio, there was always the concern that this code could be read by anybody. So each of the countries had a way of scrambling up the messages, like a modern day encryption, if you like, so that even if you knew the language of the people transmitting, it wouldn't make any sense. You had to not only decrypt the code, you had to then translate it from that language as well. It was a double barrel challenge process, and Eric was becoming very good at this. As a result of this prediction ahead of time about this ship, or this armada, and then the subsequent realization of this, Eric and his comrades began to see the power of the empirical method. Obviously yesterday, the ability to predict the future. Eric, by virtue of breaking the code, now had the ability to see what could happen before it actually happened, and this was vital intelligence. There's a quote here that you can see on the screen. Eric recalls a story in his personal diaries, one particular time when there was a code being tapped out from one officer to another, and he intercepted it. And as you can see on the screen, Eric says he was very pleased because when the receiving officer heard the message, it didn't make sense. And so the officer said, "Can you please send the message again?" But Eric got all of this, including that question. He says, "Wow, I was so proud of myself because I already knew what the message was before the intended recipient could figure out what it was." So Eric was doing as good as or better than the people the messages were intended for. And that gave him a real confidence boost. That made him feel very, very pleased. I'm just wondering how you'd feel tonight if you could break a code. What if it was possible for you to pick up some special intelligence? Like Eric, that we've been looking at earlier, what would it be like if you were able to pick something up like this? With that in mind, I want to invite you to come back with me to this skeptical King Nebuchadnezzar, this guy who's happy to kill faulty magicians. He's threatened the lives of his own magicians, and he said, "I'm happy to take you guys out. I think you guys are lying to me, but I want to get the real story. Give me the real military intelligence." Maybe we can help him out. Let's see how we go. This passage here, this text, comes from the writings of a prophet called Daniel. In years gone by, this name has been very, very famous and well known, but in the last 150 years or so, hasn't been quite so recognized or so well read. According to the text that we have, and by the way, we do have some fragments of this text as well, also from Qumran, as we were looking at last night. This is what the text says. "While your majesty was sleeping, you dreamed about coming events. He who reveals secrets has shown you what is going to happen, and it is not because I am wiser than anybody else that I know the secret of your dream, but because God wants you to understand what was in your heart." So Daniel is saying here, it's not because I'm a great magical code breaker, but it's because I've got a God who wants to help you, and I'm just here to help you break that code. "In your vision, O Majesty, you saw standing before you a huge, shining statue of a man. It was a frightening sight. The head of the statue was made of fine gold, its chest and arms were silver, its belly and thighs were bronze, its legs were iron, its feet were a combination of iron and baked clay. As I watched, a rock was cut from a mountain, but not by human hands. It struck the feet of iron and clay, smashing them to bits. The whole statue was crushed into small pieces of iron, clay, bronze, silver, and gold. Then the wind blew all this away without a trace, like a chaff on the threshing floor. But the rock that knocked the golden statue down became a great mountain that covered the whole earth. That was the dream. Now we will tell the king what it means." The question is, can we trust the interpretation of the dream? Do we know that Daniel got it right? There's a big claim going on here. How do we know? Maybe it's all made up. Maybe it's mythical. My friends will tell me, "Nathan, it's a legend, it's a story, it's something that somebody just decided to write for their own benefit." So let me just share with you a couple of thoughts to ponder here. Some say this is not historical, but other people say, "Yeah, yes it is." And then the retort comes back, "Well, no it's not." But there are some points to ponder here. There are some things for us to think about. Whatever, and as Dr. Pandit shared with us in the previous evenings, as we're going for a bit of a journey, it's good to keep both options open. So let's just go through both sides here, and let's just see how much sense each of these choices make. Let's just make some observations first off about what the text is actually telling us. First of all, the writer seems to write assuming that we will accept the events as historical. Now we can question the writer's accuracy, but at least the way he's playing his cards, it seems like he would want us to at least assume that he was telling a true story. The writer seems to think that we will believe him when he tells us that the king was a skeptic. So he's not trying to convince us that the king was a skeptic, he's just writing it as if it was the case. It's just an assumption. He also thinks that we will believe that the king was not satisfied merely with status or privilege or the fancy appearance of his own wise men. And fourthly, people would favour, or the writer would want us to think that people would favour a foreign prisoner as a seer. That means someone who can, figure out the future based upon talking to the gods. If he was able to visualize someone else's dream. So whether or not the story is true, it seems like the author, whoever he was, would have had these ideas in mind. And this brings us to a very interesting challenge. What's that, you might say? Well, first of all, skepticism is already in view. If you're bringing skepticism to the table and saying, but wait a minute, hang on, I've got a skeptical question to ask, too late. It's already in the text. The text itself is skeptical. The text is asking us to assume a skeptical position. And it's saying, given your position in solidarity with the king as a skeptic, how will you then be satisfied? Second of all, it's possible that we have falsification here because we're going to have a series of claims that can be seen and then we can check it out for ourselves. What if we got checked out the data and it was wrong? What if we could prove that the Daniel text was in fact incorrect? If that was the case, it would be buried. We could discredit the whole thing out of hand. And of course, with that in mind, we now have an empirical analysis on our hands. We have the ability to adopt the scientific inquiry and actually ask ourselves, hey, wait a minute. There's a hypothesis here. Let's check it out. Let's see if it makes sense. All of these three terms are on the table, and as a result of that, it'll be very interesting to see, as we look at the two possibilities, how this is going to add up. Let's just have a look now at Daniel's interpretation. This is what the text says Daniel said. Now you can withhold judgment if you like. Let's be skeptical if you like. But let's just read what the text says. It says this: Your Majesty, you are the greatest of kings. The God of heaven has given you sovereignty, power, strength, and honour. He made you the ruler of all the inhabited world and has put even the wild animals and birds under your control. You are the head of gold. And there's a map there kind of outlining at this time in history the area that this kingdom was reigning. Admittedly, it isn't the entire world, but it was certainly at that time, we'll look at some other detail in just a minute, this was the time where the control, the financial centres and the international flavour of antiquity was very firmly established. This next part of Daniel's interpretation says this: after your kingdom, see that little statue on the map down there, after the golden head, you'll come to an end. Another kingdom inferior to yours will rise to take your place. After that, a third kingdom of bronze. And after that, a fourth kingdom as strong as iron. That kingdom will smash and crush all previous empires, just as iron smashes and crushes everything it strikes. The feet, if you look very carefully with a magnifying glass, the feet are made of part iron and part clay. Some parts of this empire will be strong, others will be weak. The mixture of iron and clay also shows that these kingdoms will not strengthen themselves by forming alliances with each other through intermarriage. They will not hold together, just as iron and clay do not mix. After this, during the reign of these kingdoms, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed or conquered. It will crush all these kingdoms into nothingness, and it will stand forever. That is the meaning of the rock cut out from the mountain, though not by human hands, that crushed in pieces the statue of iron, bronze, clay, silver, and gold. The great God has shown the king what will happen in the future. The dream is true, and its meaning is certain. Why does this matter? Why does it matter? Well, my friend Josephus says this. And Josephus, by the way, has a different worldview to me, but he makes this comment. He says, "Now, if anyone consider these things, he will find that God takes care of mankind, and by all ways possible foreshows, or tells us in advance, what is for our or their preservation." So the code isn't just for fun, the code is for our own benefit. And that's, I think, something really important to remember. If we recall yesterday, it's not just about magic tricks, it's about being able to see what's coming up so that we can prepare for it. If you knew that there was going to be a stock market crash, you'd probably play your financial market differently. If you knew that a burglar was coming to break into your house, you might prepare your house differently. This is information, Josephus says, for our own benefit. Just ponder a question about Daniel and the text, because some of my friends say the text was written traditionally way back like 600 years BC, and we're going to look at both options. Some people say the text was written quite late, like about 200 BC. That's the more popular scholarly perspective today. Let's have a look at both of these options and just see how they weigh out. It just so happens that if we take the early date for writing of this text, the question now is that Daniel passage we just read, maybe it's too incredible, maybe it's too amazing. There's no way a human could do that, so it must be that the person wrote the text later. It must be that the events happened first, and then somebody came along and said, hey, I just happened to write this hundreds of years ago. I wrote it yesterday just on secretly, but it was written a few hundred years ago. I want to just share with you what I predicted before it happened, even though it's all a bunch of lies. Let's just have a look at these two views. The first view, let's pretend the text was written when the text claims it was written. Let's pretend it was written 600 odd BC, in the 6th century, 550 or thereabouts, plus or minus. If it was written back then, that would mean that to this time there had not been really a world empire concept. There have been some pretty strong nations. The Assyrians, the Hittites, the Egyptians had done really well, but they'd always had some rivals. There'd never been an uncontested world superpower. But at this time, Daniel is saying that there would be a new concept where world empires would now begin. He said that there'd be 3 more after this one. And he also said that there'd be no more after those 4. And there's just interesting corollaries with the metals and the details about these kingdoms in a parallel passage, which are very interesting. He also said that God's kingdom would be finally established. Now that's a traditional view, but what about if we want to take another perspective? Let's follow the modern scholarship perspective that says, well, there's no way somebody could have written that in advance. It must have been written quite recently. Maybe, after all of this happened, then somebody looked at the newspapers, wrote up an article and pretended that it was predicted, even though it was just written after the fact. That's a common complaint today. Well, if that's the case, you've got to now realize that despite world kingdoms happening in the last 400 years, now, all of a sudden, in 200 BC, we're stopping. Why? Never again in human history will there be another universal kingdom. We've got 2,000 years of data, but Daniel, allegedly in 200 BC, is now going to say, for 2,000 more years, nothing's going to happen like what happened the last 400 years. Never again. And of course, there's still a possibility, you can't discount it, it could be, even in the late dates, that God's eternal kingdom might still be established. So whichever way we pick, whether we pick the left blue option or the right orange option, whichever date you want to pick for the Daniel text, there's some challenges there, and I'm just encouraging you to have a think about that one. How do you want to position those challenges given your particular dating preference? And of course, there could be ranges in between those two dates, but those two dates are the outliers. We cannot have the Daniel text written before the 6th century because of the reasons that we can go into in Q&A, and it cannot be later than the 2nd century for reasons I can also cover in the Q&A. How did Daniel's code match with reality? And I just have a bit of a teaser story to finish up, and we'll also have a look at my friend Eric. I was in California for 5 years, and when I was over there, I was in charge of an aviation program and had a lot of fun. The registrar for our university or college was a young, or a wonderful German lady, and her name was Susie. And she wrote a book about her dad. And I want to just spend a few minutes sharing with you what is the relevance of Daniel's prophecy, that passage of the 4 kingdoms, and how does that pay out? How does it actually match with the real world today? My friend's dad's name was Franz, and he was a young man, had a lovely family. You see the wife and the kids on the screen there. The little girl on the right there is, I believe that's Susie. And she might be the little one actually. And as they were growing up in Germany, when World War II began, the dad was conscripted into the German army. And he was not really too anxious to go fighting with Hitler, but he didn't have a whole lot of choice. So he showed up and reported for duty. There's a picture of him there in his uniform. He joined Pioneer Company 699 with 1,200 men, and his job was to go around building bridges and roads so that the Wehrmacht could make their progress and conduct their campaigns. Franz was doing his best to obey his country, but he had a bit of a conscience, and he was not able to go against his conscience. And as he was asked to do various things, he got in trouble repeatedly and ended up with a suspended court-martial for insubordination. He wasn't trying to do the wrong thing, he was just trying to follow his conscience. As he was going through the various towns, he got an idea of what his fellow German soldiers were doing to the civilians. And so he began, as part of his duty, to go into the town, and among other business, he would seek out the civilians and tell them, excuse me, sir, ma'am, I'm from the German army. Right behind me, all my mates, and they're targeting this group, and that group will be here tomorrow. If you want to save your life, get out today. And as a German officer, if he'd been caught telling that, he would have been shot. So he was taking a lot of risks, but he really wanted to do the honourable thing. He had grown up being taught that it was not appropriate to take human life. It was his personal conviction, and he was not willing to kill people, even if it was the enemy. They were deep, deep in Russia, and one evening as he was in Russia, a warm Wednesday afternoon, he was reading his Bible, because that was sort of a bit of a tradition he had, a bit of a practice for himself. And Lieutenant Goodschalk came up to him in a big steaming huff. Goodschalk and this guy Franz had not been the best of friends, and Goodschalk kind of sneered, Is that silly book of Jewish fairy tales you're reading again, is it, Mr. Franz? If I had a chance, I'd liquidate you just like them. And Franz didn't say anything, and of course the lieutenant was very angry. A couple of nights later, another officer came up to Eric and said, what do you know about the Bible? And Franz said, yeah, I read it a bit. He said, come tomorrow morning, I want to ask you some questions. Next morning, Franz reported for duty with his Bible and began to discuss the very passage that we're talking about tonight in Daniel. if you can see on the screen there, a little postcard that Franz had in his pocket. Can you see the little statue there with the head and the arms and the torso and the legs? And on the back with a typewriter in German is some of the key details and dates and notes. And Franz turned to one of his officers and he said, I understand that you're a history professor. Can you please help me confirm some of my details? And the commander said, that's correct. Yes, I'm a history teacher. I used to teach ancient history before the war started. So Franz began to go through this very passage, each of the kingdoms, the first kingdom, the second kingdom, the third kingdom, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, the dates, the kings, the battles. And Franz said, how am I doing? Is what I'm saying, does the Daniel passage match with your teaching in the history class? And the commander said, yes, it does. And then Franz got very focused and said, very serious, and said this. Now you notice the legs of iron, but at the bottom of the legs we have the feet. The feet are part iron and part clay. And the German commanders, 3 of them, said to Franz, what does this mean? And Franz said, it can only mean one thing. Our Führer, Hitler, will never be able to unite the world because according to Bible prophecy, it will never happen. We've had the 4 kingdoms, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome. Now that those 4 have happened, as valiantly as we fight, the predictions of God himself are against us. And the 3 commanders said to Franz, you keep quiet, don't tell anybody. Shut up, you'll be in trouble. Next morning, Franz was secretly approached by one of the 3, and they said, can I please borrow your Bible? I want to have a look. And for the next week, this commander read through Franz's Bible, and they had a secret meeting a short time later, and Franz and this commanding officer said, don't tell anybody, but we're going to stockpile some fuel and some rations, just enough, so that if we ever have to retreat, we'll have enough fuel and rations to get back to Germany. This was very treasonous. No one else was talking about this. Morale was very high in the German army. Everybody else was saying, we're going to win, we're going to smash everybody, we're going to be in Moscow by Christmas, it's all going to be good. But Franz and his company, 1,200 men, they secretly began to stockpile fuel and supplies. By the end of those summer months, it came out that the war did in fact fall apart, and as Franz and his team were given the orders to retreat, they were one of the only groups that made it back to Germany. They had been the furthest into Russia, they had the furthest to come back, but they were the only ones that were able, as far as I can tell, maybe you could check out the facts and find someone else who was able to, but they were the only ones of those pioneer company that made it back to safety from the Russian revenge. I want to just finish our story tonight with Eric. Eric, our Australian codebreaker, the one who had been able to decipher all these messages. He became so successful, but unfortunately his health began to deteriorate. And it's a bit unclear exactly what the reasons are, but it seems like there were also some jealousy or some factions. When Pearl Harbor happened in December 1941, the Americans came over to Australia and took over all the intelligence operations, and Eric, who had been seen as the key leader, the primary intelligence expert, was all of a sudden pushed off to the side as a junior, and there was quite a bit of friction between himself and the American leaders. And after a few months, he was ousted, sent away from what's called the Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne operations. He was let go, and the Americans took over. But his work had been so successful and so comprehensive that by the time he was reposted under the Americans in Brisbane under General MacArthur, he was able to intercept some new messages, and these new messages were able to help him predict each and every day when the Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft were going out for their bombing missions. Eric was able to tell what their target was before they got there, so he could warn his friends, hey, today is going to be your place about 10:30 this morning, so get ready, they'll be on their way. And this enabled Eric to help his friends out. Eric, there's a bit of controversy about this as well, but Eric also was able to intercept the messages of Admiral Yamamoto and lead to the successful interception of that aircraft. It's a contested historical point, but I think it's contested because Eric, once again, had been so successful that he'd got people jealous. He'd gotten people unhappy or angry with him. Here's a picture of the building where he worked in Brisbane. I just want to ask in closing tonight, why is it important to break these codes? Why did we go through these stories tonight? What's the relevance? What's the point? What did Eric achieve by breaking these codes? What did Franz achieve by sharing his understanding of the codes with his officers? Well, it seems to me that there's several points here. Obviously, in Eric and Franz's case, they're able to provide information for the well-being of their own family, their friends, their country, and in Franz's case, to get his troops, or his company, back home to Germany. We could even say it's a matter of life and death. And maybe for you and me today, if we ourselves want to take advantage of the codes in the Bible, we've just scratched the surface tonight. We'll go through a list in just a moment, but there's a lot of opportunity here for us to pick up special intelligence for ourselves, maybe financial or political advantages, maybe identifying and understanding the mission of Jesus. How do we know who Jesus is? We kind of hinted last night at Jesus' birth, but there's a lot more to Jesus in his adult years and his work on earth that is covered throughout these codes. Maybe if we read the codes and understood them, we'd have a better idea of what's going on. This could be a matter of life and death for our loved ones. There's a list of fairly famous people through history who have ignored the code. They've said, you know what, I don't believe Daniel. He's dreaming. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Some funny writer from antiquity, probably made up anyway. And each of these three on the screen made it their mission to prove Daniel wrong. Napoleon, Hitler, and Saddam. I don't think they're the only ones. They're the ones that came to my mind immediately. Maybe you can think of some more. But those three publicly, explicitly, intentionally set out to prove Daniel wrong. I wonder who the next one's going to be. But it's not going to work according to the predictions of Daniel. There are some distinct codes that we'll just list tonight. We're not going to go through them. But here we go. We have 5 different occurrences of a 70-year prophecy, 3.5 times prophecy codes. There's 2 1,260-day codes. There's 2 42-month codes. There's a 2,300-day code. There's one of those, 1,290, a 1,335-day code, plus the 70-week prophecy. I'm just floating those out there as a bit of an opportunity. These are the kinds of codes that are floating around at the moment. They could, in fact, impact you personally. They could potentially impact your family life and your well-being. And I'm just inviting you tonight, if you haven't already, maybe you want to check some of these out and see what the intelligence briefing might have to offer. You know, just this year, the Doomsday Clock is put out by a group called the Bulletin. This is a group of experts who specialise in nuclear arms stockpiling, but of more recent times they're also worried about climate change, they're worrying about cybersecurity and technology. And there's an interesting quote here. This is Dr. William Perry, who's a mathematician and an engineer. He says this: on balance, we see this year at least as dangerous as 1953. And they've decided this year to set that doomsday clock to the closest time to midnight they've ever done. It's been done once before in 1953, during some very turbulent, troubling times. 2 minutes to midnight. There's the quotes. It seems like, as they're saying at the bottom there, the fact that we didn't wind the hands back is bad news indeed. These are people who are very smart, who are connected to the intelligence going on in the world around us today, and they're a bit nervous. But I want to just share a bit of a promise or a bit of a hope with you. We don't need to be nervous. This is the hope, this is the good news or the encouragement tonight. This is also part of Daniel's code, and this is something that I take to heart as an encouragement. If you're nervous and worried or stressed about what's going on, have a look at this promise in closing. It says this: "Then the one who looked like a man touched me again." This is Daniel speaking. "And I felt my strength returning. 'Don't be afraid,' he said, 'for you are very precious to God. Peace. Be encouraged. Be strong.' As he spoke these words to me, I suddenly felt stronger and said to him, 'Please speak to me, my Lord, for you have strengthened me.'" I've had a chance to go through quite a bit of stuff tonight. I do want to give you a chance to just weigh up the options that we are looking at. It just so happens that last night we had a look at the blue circle, magic versus predicting the future. Tonight, the second circle. Which makes more sense to you? Which of those scales is more compelling to you? Which one gives you more hope? Which one gives you more security? Which one is more logical given the data, both past and present? I'd invite you to have a look at the survey tonight and fill it out for me. If you want to double check what I've gone through tonight, there are a couple of hardcover Bibles in the back that are available if you haven't got a Bible already at home. And I'd be happy to point out to you the very passages that I was reading from tonight or at a subsequent time. And it just so happens that as you go reading through this, you too might have that courage and strength that Daniel had. Thank you so much. There's a question here: where can we study the prophecies? Do you recommend any guides or resources, etc.? Yes, there's several different ways to go about it. Different people have different ways of learning better. Perhaps one easy way to jump into it is there's been a film that's come out just recently entitled Kingdom Come. And I have access to that. There's a possibility we could get it screened. There is a plan coming up after the end of this week. In subsequent weeks, we plan to have a small informal get-together on Wednesday nights, and there's definitely an opportunity to chat one-on-one or in small groups on this very thing. There are also some websites that are available. Perhaps the best thing for me to do with this question is I'll get a list of things together and try and give a more cohesive answer for this one. But I do know that we do have some resources available. My friend Roger has been looking at sourcing some material, and as soon as I find out more, I'll get that out to you. So if you wrote this question down, maybe come see me privately or see the people at the table at the back and just say, hey, I'd like to find out some more. Do you have some, there should be some either paper study guides or online study guides, and so we'd be happy to study with you as well. And by the way, it's an ongoing process for all of us. I don't have all the answers. I don't know anybody in the world that has all the answers. But as Eric was going through his code breaking, it's a real exciting thing to break a bit of a code and get the satisfaction, hey, it's making sense, things are adding up. You mentioned last night that carbon dating was used to determine the age of the Isaiah scroll. How sure are we that the rate of decay is the same today as it was in 100 BC? That's a great question, and I don't know how to answer that one. My understanding is that the rate of decay is assumed to be constant, but as a way of verifying or knowing that for sure, I don't know if we do have a way. I guess conceivably it could be argued that the rate has changed. As I said last night, the scroll was dated a couple of different, or I think 3 different ways. It was dated by radiocarbon dating, but it was also dated by the ink and also by the paleography, the style of writing and the text. So it wasn't just the carbon dating that we have to date this scroll, it was the several data points, and they all agree on the same date. When they all agree, you kind of have to ask yourself, even if we were to question the radiocarbon dating, how valid is our question if the other data matches up? And by the way, groups from both sides want to change the dating for the scroll. There are some believing types, the believing inquirers, who want the scroll to be older. And there is the disbelieving inquirers who want the scroll to be later. And they're both disagreeing with each other, but they've had to come to a compromise based upon the evidence that they can both agree on. Both sides are agreeing. We're going to call it the date range 350 to 100 BC or BCE. So I'm just the messenger. As I said, I quoted that radiocarbon journal last night. If you want to get deep into the radiocarbon dating question, those people are peer-reviewed. They're required to be answerable to their group of fellow radiocarbon dating experts. I'm not in that field of expertise, but they are accountable to each other. And if you've got that question on those details, maybe you could approach Radiocarbon Journal and question them. That would be a good question. I'd enjoy the answer to that. Shouldn't it be fair to say other items found by archaeologists that are said to be billions of years old through carbon dating also accurate? Yeah, that's a good question, and I guess that'd be a question for the radiocarbon dating experts. I guess if we use one standard, it needs to apply consistently, unless we've got a good reason to say it doesn't apply. So yeah, good observation and good question. Question here, why is the first half of the book of Daniel written in the third person and the second half in the first person? Great question. My friend Dr. Pundit would say, why questions are very hard. I wasn't there, so I'm not quite sure what the reason was. I will say this, in the past, a lot of the believing type inquirers have assumed Daniel was written at one time in one place by one person, and the more disbelieving inquirers have said that must have been lots of different people who put the book together at different times, and all of these idiosyncrasies like, you know, third person, first person. The language of Daniel changes in the middle of the book as well, and the disbelieving inquirer says, haha, evidence of different authorship. Interestingly, Josephus makes the comment that Daniel himself had written several books, and the assumption seems to be that Daniel himself was writing at different times and places, different parts, and then perhaps somebody else put it all together. Or maybe Daniel himself put it all together. So as to the first half being in the third person, the second half being in the first person, that's a good question, and I don't know if I gave you a very good answer, but certainly it's been discussed a lot, and I think there's, for myself, I'm happy with the concept that maybe Daniel wrote in different places and times to put it together, and if you want to say it was written later, that's fine too. Keep in mind though, if you say it's written later, we still have all of these problems that are in view regardless of which position we take. So whichever side you pick, if you want to pick the blue side or the orange side, that's fine. But you have to deal with these problems unless I've missed something. And I'm happy to admit that I may have missed something. If I have, feel free to check me out. I've got these 3 questions here. Happy to take some more written questions. Happy to take a verbal question, an oral question, if you feel like you're more comfortable speaking rather than writing. If you'd rather be anonymous and write, I do want to finish by the next 10 minutes or so, or thereabouts, but happy to field any more questions if you have any.
What about being anonymous if you want to talk?
Good luck with that one. Good to see you, Mick. Cool. Well, thank you for your time tonight. Happy to field questions personally, publicly, and tomorrow night is a personal story. I used to be a pilot for the Royal Flying Doctor Service, had a great time, very, very exciting job, highly recommended, and tomorrow is entitled something along the lines of Code 1 Medic, Stealing from the Reaper. Bring your friend tomorrow night, and I think it'll grab your heart. Thank you.